Pollination, love and babies. The notes of Lenora Larson are read by Jacob Waterborg. The original presentation of September 9, 2024 was lost. The love connection. Plants need love too. Yes, there is asexual reproduction, cuttings, divisions and tissue culture, but most plants do it the old-fashioned way. Boy meets girl for sex. But plants have a problem. They don't have feet or wings, so they can't go looking for love. That's where the pollinators come in. They are the plant's love connection. You frequently see bees and other insects on flowers. That's not a coincidence. Flowers specifically invite insects to do their bidding, to take the boys, which carry the pollen, to the girls, the ovaries, the eggs, to fertilize and make new individuals, the seeds. It's a true love connection. Our agenda today is to talk about some botany and why flowering plants. Then meet the pollinators that are important for those flowering plants. The threats to pollinators and what you can do to minimize those threats and keep pollination populations healthy. Many people believe the pollinators are butterflies, hummingbirds, and unicorns. No, that's not correct. There is some old botany to consider. Non-bird dinosaurs lived between 66 and 245 million years ago. It is a conjecture that the extreme pressure placed on terrestrial plants by the giant dinosaur herbivores forced a natural selection as plants needed to become more reproductively efficient and more diverse to survive that munching. This could be the reason that so-called angiosperms became so abundant. Angiosperms are the plants with flowers. The meteorite that hit the Earth 66 million years ago and that wiped out about 80% of animals and that cooled the planet gave the adaptable angiosperms a chance to become dominant. Why are angiosperms more adaptable? Gymnosperms, meaning naked seeds, are simple plants like ferns. They have no flowers, they may have cones, sometimes very small ones, and their sex cells, their gametes, contain one set of chromosomes, one genome. The chromosomes contain the genes, and after sex, two genomes are combined into the egg, and that's the diploid egg that grows out to a diploid plant with two genomes. Angiosperms have flowers and ovaries that enclose the seed, which is often growing out to the fruit. About 125 million years ago, a mutational change happened in plants. The gametes in angiosperms, which had initially one genome, multiplied without division to have two and ultimately 4 genomes per pollen or per ovum per gamete. This tetraploidization, as it's called, at 125 million years ago, gave a large redundancy of genomes in plant cells of angiosperms. So in an angiosperm, like you see on the right, there are 8 genomes per cell. Now, if some of the genes in those genomes change, there are plenty of other equivalent genes to keep the plant alive and fertile. So angiosperms are much more changeable, adaptable. In fact, it may take as few as 3 generations to go from one plant species by some small changes in those genomes to be a new species. And stress is often a factor that leads to a selection of a new species. At the right, you see one of those angiosperms, the night hibiscus, with its nice big flower, and at the center, the sex organs. Those sex organs, as you see here, enlarged on the left for the hibiscus, make it easy for visiting pollinators to pick up pollen from the anthers, stick them on their body, and bring them to another plant, where they may rub off on the style which ends in the stigma. Pollen on top of the stigma will grow down the pipe, down where the ovules are, and they lead to fermentation. Now, this morphology, where stigma are way above the pollen containing stamens, prevent self-fertilization. You see it in the plant on the left. The stigma are those red balls at the end. The yellow dots below it are the anthers with the pollen grains. This morphology positions the stigmata high above the pollen, and that prevents self-fertilization. In some plants, that self-fertilization is prevented because parts of the flower mature at different times. The pollen, the boys, mature early, and the girls, the ovals, late, or vice versa. So you have two flowers going to a flower going through 2 stages. That's a perfect or monoicous flower where both pollen and ovals are present in the same flower, even though not at the same time. However, you have other species that go even more extreme. Dioecious plants, they only make flowers with only pollen or with only stamens. Therefore, you cannot get self-fertilization because it's in the cross-fertilization that the strength of biological diversity rises. So, how to get those boys, the pollen, to the girls, the ovals? You can do it by self-fertilization, but then the combination of genomes of male and female is the same as the plant that you start with. However, in wind, when you get pollen across to the other individuals of the species, or especially with cross-pollination using animal mediators, which is 80% of all the flowers, then you make new combinations of 4 genomes with 4 genomes a lot of new combinations allow you to do selection, mutation and selection. So bringing the boys to the girls looks like pimps. So who are the pimps? Those pollinators. The best pollinators are the ones that take the pollen from one plant, from one flower, and bring them to the stamens, the flower of the next flower of the same species. That way you get cross-fertilization and new genome combinations. Which are the best flower pimps? In the rainforest, it's often the hummingbirds. They go for the nectar, they pick up the pollen on one flower, they go to the next flower and leave pollen behind in that flower. In the deserts, it's bats. And in temperate zones, it's insects, like the bee shown on the right. So why do pollinators visit flowers? Initially, obviously, curiosity. There's something there to visit. They're attracted by color, by shape, or by fragrance, like the honeybee on tropical milkweed on the right. Butterflies and bees don't wake up in the morning and say, I think I'm going to pollinate some flowers today. They have no idea that they are the pimps. So the flowers attract those pollinators and they keep on hanging around, go from flower to flower, pick up pollen and then bring those pollen by touch to the next flower and the next flower. It's a system that depends on bribes of the pollinators. So, if we talk about color, it's not necessarily the color we see. It's important what the pollinator sees, like the butterfly or the bee looking at black-eyed Susans. They don't see yellow flowers with a dark center. They see white pointing petals pointing to the center where there is the nectar and the pollen and the stamens. Color is often due to polarized light. So as you can see in this flower on the left, the yellow petals look good to us, but in fact for insects they are a white and then to the dark center of the flower where the pollen are. They are guides to the nectar. Other attractions are the shape. For instance, butterflies, they can land here on the flat landing strip of a dog-faced sulfur butterfly on a zinnia. There is place to land and place to put the proboscis down the tubes of the little flowers in the center to pick up the nectar and inadvertently pollen. Or the flowers are shaped like red tubules that are attractive to hummingbirds, like on this lobelia, the cardinal flower. And the third major attractant is fragrance. Most bees come towards the smell of a flower. Butterflies mostly on color. So here you see the bees going into the center of this datura, which is a reeking type of flower. But it not necessarily needs to be one. It's a combination often of color and shape and fragrance. Like in the bee orchid on the left, or in the pawpaw flower on the right. So what keeps pollinators coming back? It's the nectar, food. Here a bumblebee sipping nectar from the bottom of a flower of a liatris. The flowers pollinated by beetles have copious pollen. The beetles come there to eat the pollen. For bees, it's both pollen and nectar together. They eat that and they collect it on their legs and they regurgitate that to feed their larvae. Honeybees do it even uniquely by making honey out of pollen and nectar, and they store it in wax chambers. I'm talking about nectar, but the nectar is formed by specialized cells below the ovaries, deep in the flower. In tiny doses, they force a repeat visit of thirsty pollen-covered pollinators to come back for some more nectar. So bees and butterflies can tell time. They quickly learn how long it takes for each flower to refill its nectaries before they return to that same flower. Bees evolved from wasps, and they co-evolved with flowering plants. So bees are the primary pollinator of our flowers. They are uniquely adapted, often so specialized that only a single flower is the target for a specific type of bee. Here you see a carpenter bee on Caryopteryx. The bee's body is made to have pollen combs on their hind legs, bristles, and many species of bees have specialized pollen baskets on their hind legs to collect the pollen. You see the bee on the right covered by pollen on its legs. So if it climbs from one flower into the next flower, those pollen are pushed off, caught by the stamens, and cross-fertilization can take place. Now, an important part of pollination, effective pollination, is that they are flower faithful. So a bee will go from one species at a time, from one flower to the next flower to the next flower. So if you put hives out in the field and there is one crop, you, for instance, in the hay, you make a different type of honey. If the zinnias are blooming, they go from zinnia to zinnia to zinnia, carrying zinnia pollen to zinnia stamens, and therefore accomplish pollination that is effective. Adult bees eat both the nectar and the pollen. About 30% of our native bee species can only use one particular genus or species of a plant. Here you see the blue sage bee that is collecting nectar from Salvia azurea, a pitcher sage. Bees have maternal behavior. They're really going for the flowers to collect the food, a mixture of pollen and nectar, for their larvae to eat until they pupate and come out as adult insects. Some of them are in colony form, like the honeybees. Other ones in looser associations, like the miner bee or the carpenter bee or the leafcutter bee. Sometimes they are just single nest cells. The regurgitated nectar and pollen are feeding their larvae until the larvae pupate and come out as adult insects. Honeybees are actually a domesticated species of animals. They're not native to the US. They were first imported from Europe in 1622 and gradually and quickly naturalized across the whole continent. They build large social hives of wax, and they make honey from the collected nectar and pollen. Only 8 of the 20,000 species of bees make honey. 20,000 species, many more than in the US, are native to Europe and Africa. In honeybees, you have a specialization. You have a single queen per colony. You produce only a few drones that are born in the fall, then mate with virgin queens who start a new colony the next spring, being fertilized and overwintering. Most of the bees you see are worker bees. They're asexual, they're smaller, and they collect the pollen and the nectar. How do they find the flowers to collect pollen and nectar? Bees have a very specialized way of navigation. They have a dance. They communicate when they return to the hive by wiggling their abdomen and making circles, half circles and eights. And the axis of that common part of that eight is the direction in which the other worker bees need to go out of the hive to find the best flower that day. This behavior, the wiggle dance, was described by Carl von Frisch in 1967 only. The best dancers collect the information of which is the best flower of the day. The only problem is systemic insecticide impair a bee's navigational system and memory, and then they can't find their way home, or they can have forgotten how to dance, and they impair the hive's function. Out of the 20,000 known native bees, only 4,000 species occur in the USA. And in Kansas, eastern Kansas, we have about 400 species. Out of those, just bumblebees are already 30 species, and they're harder to tell apart than skipper butterflies. The 400 native bees species in eastern Kansas are solitary species. They don't make hives. They don't defend hives. They are peaceful, and they do not sting unless, obviously, you harass them themselves. So a digger bee on the pita on the right is a solitary native bee from eastern Kansas. Why don't we see more native bees in our yards? That's because bees live only a short while, only 6 weeks of adult activity. In those 6 weeks, they lay eggs. They provide those eggs, those growing larvae, with bee bread. That is pollen and nectar. The larvae grow, they pupate, and they emerge as adults in the spring or summer to mate and restart the cycle. So they have short lifespans. They're actually limited to temperature, by temperature. So when the temperatures finally rise into the 80s, leaf cutter bees, like the ones shown here, come out. They start laying eggs and collect pollen, make their nests, and they are done by late August, 6-8 weeks. They build their leaf nest in existing holes. That will the bee house. And in fact, compared to honeybees that collect a lot of nectar and pollen into the hive, these solitary bees are even more efficient pollinators than honeybees. Bumblebees are the only native social bee that we have. They form small colonies in underground shelters. In that shelter, the young pregnant queen that survives the winter starts a new colony in spring. And if you start threatening that little hive, that nest where the bumblebee has her children, her sisters, her mother, of course they will attack. Normally, single bees don't attack. They are non-threatening. If you look at the life cycle of a bumblebee, the bumblebee hides in her underground nest in winter. They come out in spring and start feeding on flowers, and late spring they go into their nest that they build and start laying eggs, and more eggs, and more eggs. Those eggs produce new generations of bumblebees that go out and start making their nest and will start laying eggs as well. In fall, fertilized bumblebees will overwinter and they will start again in spring. The old queens die in fall. The young, newly fertilized queens hibernate as an adult. So, let's have a look at just 4 different of the 30 different bumblebee species in Kansas. They're very hard to distinguish. They have color patches, white and dark bristles in patterns that are unique for each species. They're hard to identify. Bumblebees are very effective pollinators because you hear bumblebees buzz. Many plants like tomatoes require a buzz pollination. The honeybees do not perform sonication, buzzing. Only bumblebees. They're the best sonicators in the world. They go into the flower, they buzz, the buzz releases the pollen, and the pollen stick to the body of the bumblebee while the bumblebee is eating released pollen. Now you can easily distinguish bumblebees from carpenter bees. Bumblebees have furry butts on the left. Carpenter bees have a shiny butt. Here is sweat bees. That's the largest, second largest number of species in the world are sweat bees. There are 4,500 species worldwide. Other more native bees. The longhorn, that has long antennae, and the cuckoo bee, a kleptoparasite laying its eggs in the nests of other bees. It doesn't make its own nest. Here you see an ashy miner bee, one of the 1300 different species of miners. Now wasps, the original form that bees originated from, are different. They are carnivorous. Their parents bring them paralyzed insects or spiders. But the adults, they drink nectar and eat pollen for their own feeding, and thus you see them act as de facto pollinators, collecting, eating flowers. After bees and wasps, the second best pollinators are flies. Here you see them on Queen Anne's lace flowers. Little flowers among flies among a big fly. Now, the common housefly is not a pollinator. It eats carrion. It doesn't eat nectar. There is a species of fly, the hover or flower flies, syrphids. They evolved to look and act like bees, but they're not bees. Just look at how their eyes are. They are eyes in the center, not on the side of the head. Flies don't feed their larvae, they just lay eggs on plants. They eat aphids, so they lay their eggs on plants infected with aphids. And the brown husks are the empty dead aphids infected and killed by the parasitoid brachnid wasp. Here's a tangle vein fly. They are parasitoid on grasshoppers. They have an exceedingly light, high-pitched whining buzz. So I already pointed out that about the eyes. If you look at bees, bees have large almond-shaped eyes on the side of their head. Flies have large, big eyes that are merged toward the center on top of their head. That's an easy way to see. You can also see it from their wings. Bees have two pairs of wings, and at rest they're held tucked in. They have two pairs of wings, a major pair and a small balancing set of wings to allow them to maneuver in the air better. Flies, they have only one pair of wings, and at rest they spread them out. Bees also have longer antennae, and they have pollen baskets on legs or on their body, while flies have short, stubby antennae, and they don't have pollen collecting structures. Here you see the difference between bees having long antennae on the left, a kleptoparasitic cuckoo bee that lays their eggs in other bees' nests, versus the tachinid fly, a dreaded parasite that lays its eggs in caterpillars. You see, they don't have long antennae. Short stubs is typical. Here you see the eye difference. The almond-shaped eyes on the side of bees, while on the right you see a syrphid flower fly, which has the red eyes there, and they touch in the center at the top of the head. The syrphid fly on the left has a single wing set. In the right, you see that there are two wings They're partially superimposed, but they have two sets of wings, and in addition to that they have a little halter remnant wing that helps them stabilize in the air, and that's bees. Again, you can also see here the difference between the eyes. On the left, the two globes of the eyes of the fly are close in the center at the top of the head. On the right, you see the bee with clearly two globes of eyes on the left and the right side of the head. So, which are the third most effective pollinators? They are beetles. Their behavior is not specific to pollination. They move from flower to flower in search of mates. They are pollen eaters, so they eat pollen, but they are not flower and species specific. They go from one to another. They don't see color. They are mostly attracted to whitish or greenish blossoms. Here is the milkweed beetle, the milkweed longhorn beetle, and as you can see where that name comes from. Here is a soldier beetle. They are not eating your plant. The plants in their flowers make enough pollen to share with pollinators that they have invited to the party, and occasionally a soldier beetle will be part of that, eating pollen and cross-pollinating flowers. Other pollinators are moths and butterflies. Here you see the typical moth way of going to a flower. It uses its long proboscis, its long tubular nose, to go deep into the flower to go to the nectar. On the left you see the hummingbird moth using its long proboscis, its long tubular nose, to go into the center where the nectar is in the smelly datura flower. On the right you see a lichen moth. That doesn't look like a typical moth, but if you look right, it has long antennae and 4 wings. Flower moths typically fly by day, usually are brilliantly colored, and they eat the nectar of the flowers. Butterflies have a high nutrient requirement, and they use their long proboscis, seen best on the picture on the right, where the butterfly has landed on a zinnia and uses its proboscis going in and in and in to the subsequent little flowers of the center of this big composite flower to eat the nectar, to get the energy to keep on going. Other pollinators, occasional pollinators, are ants, like in this peony, where they'll defend even their flower, but rousing around inside the flower, they will lead to pollination. On the right you see a crab spider, specialized flower spiders that pollinate as they move in this milkweed. Now we come to a next section of this talk. Pollinators are in trouble. The number of bees is dropping. The number of insects in general is dropping. The number of butterflies you see are less and less. Why are they disappearing? They are so vital for the food supply of the world, and if they face extinction, we will be affected. So it's a loss. One of the causes is the loss of habitat. Every year, over 2 million acres of rural land are developed into subdivisions, shopping malls, roads. It creates an environment in which there is not a place for pollinators to live anymore, to find a home. Butterflies can maybe fly away and find a new home, but their needs are so specific they may not find a suitable habitat within a flying distance. So, what can you do? What you can do is compensate for the loss of wildflowers to make a butterfly, an insect garden. The second major loss of pollinators is due to insecticides, especially a number of modern ones like imidocycloprid, acetamiprid, thiacloprid, thiamethoxam. These are leading to paralysis and death of insects, including bees. The European Safety Agency has concluded that there is a high acute risk from exposure by way of residues in nectar of pollen. Now, these insecticides may have a half-life of only 34 days when exposed to sunlight, the way they've been tested by the companies, but if they enter the tissues and are entering the nectar, they may persist as much as 1,000 years, and low-level doses in pollen and nectar may not be killing our bees outright, but they do impair their immune system, their neurological system, memory, dancing, other behaviors necessary for foraging. And then there is a second group of massive use of herbicides that they use on acres of farmland. Where the plants are genetically modified, they're resistant to this Roundup insecticide. And so it's sprayed on acres of soybeans and corn to keep the leaves, the broadleaf weeds down, but you're also killing the insects. And a fourth one, climate change. Now, we said early in the talk that plants, because of their multiple genomes, have the capability of adapting readily. In as few as a couple of generations, they can adapt to a change in a range for plants. If they need to move north to stay in the range of temperatures, that's fine. However, the animals, the pollinators that they depend on, cannot evolve as quickly as they can. And so you get decreased pollination, declining insect and bird populations. Climate change is a killer. Overall, the current agricultural practices of monoculture, with edge-to-edge cultivation and heavy use of pesticides, is disastrous for our insect populations. And for monoculture, you don't have to look at the farmers. We do it in our lawns. We have a monoculture of grasses. They are water hogs. We use chemical fertilizers and pesticides to keep them nice and green. But the insects are dying. So what can we do? We can be a careful consumer and use control methodologies that avoid pesticides. The Cygnes Society has been started to conserve invertebrates, including our insects, native bees conservation, and one of the things they do is they will give educational information of how to make pollinator gardens, how to make bee gardens, and also to instruct farmers how they can support pollinator retention in their farming practices. Now, what does a pollinator garden look like? In full sun, here, nectar-rich flowers, lots of pollinators. You see them buzzing from flower to flower. They're colorful, they're nice. Now, do they need to be built of native plants? Not necessarily. Lots of pollinators do not care. They're pragmatists. If the plant provides the nectar that they can use, they will do the pollination that they will do through their behavior. Does it make a difference whether you have native flowers or cultivars? Not necessarily. In fact, this is an example of Pestamon digitalis. The wild type brings in a lot of insects, pollinators. Pocahontas, one cultivar with the bright flower, works well. The one that are darker in color, Husker Red, don't work as well, and Blackbird, which is the darkest purple, in fact pulls in the lowest number of pollinators. Now, there was new science that help us assess what is important to keep our bees. If you look at honeybees, they forage on flowers with a pollen ratio that have protein to lipid ratios of about 1:1. Bumblebees, they like flowers much better if there are lots of protein and much less lipid, much less fat. While mason bees forage on flowers specifically very, very high fat content. So the different flowers will support different pollinators. If you want a bee or pollinator garden, you must make a good choice for what type of plants you use. Do they flower only a week or two, like on the left? Or are they blooming non-stop months after month after month? Which do you think will serve more pollinators? But in general, the better diversity of nectar-rich pollen that bloom from March to November is the best pollinator garden you can make. So, if you have, although it's a beautiful garden, a garden full of hostas in the shade of trees, can you even change a garden like this to a pollinator garden? Yes, but only after you do a rigorous trimming with a chainsaw. Take the shade away. If you want to know when the nectar is being produced, look in spring for dandelions, verbena, columbines, bee balm. In summer it's butterfly bush, zinnias, cleome, lantana, and in fall it's caryopteryx, salvias, Tithonia sunflowers asters. The tropical milkweed and the pita species, catmint, they bloom and produce nectar the whole year long. You have to realize that some flowers are useless for pollinators. If you have sterile hybrids, like the marigolds on the left or the knockout roses on the right, they are no good. They have often no fragrance. They don't make pollen. They don't make nectar. They don't attract pimps and bribe them with nectar. They may look good to you, but not to insects. What else can you do? It's simple. You can be lazy and leave some of your dirt uncovered, like digger bee colonies under the porch of the presenter of this slideshow. They had lots of colonies, lots of nests there, and 70% of our native bee species build tunnels in bare dirt to lay their eggs and feed their larvae. So give them a chance. Also, leave dead tree snags, leave fallen trees, leave stumps, because beetle larvae will eat holes in those dead trees. They make tunnels, and they're perfect for 30% of our native bees to make a nest. And you can go commercial as well. Put up a bee house. Maintenance wise, be lazy. Leave the leaves alone. In fallen leaves, lots of insects do well, including some of our other threatened smaller animal species. If you want to educate yourself, visit the website of Xerxes and learn about pollinators. And obviously, no one prevents you from going to a bookstore or a library and use one of the books or many of the books to make your backyard a better bee haven. In summary, why do we care about our pollinators? It's practical, monetary even. 70% of human food is dependent on pollination by insects. And ethically and spiritually, it's also important. There are our fellow living beings deserving our respect and protection. Thank you for your attention.